Right, well, thank you all very much for coming to my job talk. I'm just going to very briefly say something about myself, and then I'm going to talk for about half an hour on Plato's argument that the soul has parts. So, my name is Matthew Duncombe. I finished my PhD in Cambridge last year, and at the moment I'm working in the Netherlands on a project about deductive reasoning, and I'm primarily responsible for the historical part of that project. But today I'm going to talk to you about something that came out of my PhD. And my PhD work was on Plato's notion of relational expressions. So, and that's going to play a role in Plato's argument that the soul has parts. So, first of all, the argument, or the presentation is going to fall into three parts. First of all, I'm going to talk about Plato's partition argument, as I call it. Then I'm going to discuss an objection. And then I'm going to talk about how Plato views relative terms and contrast that with how we view relative terms. And then I'm going to show how Plato's particular notion of relative terms allows him to answer the objection. So first of all, the partition argument. Setting up the argument in terms of weakness of will. So there's this problem, a classic philosophical problem that comes from Plato's Socrates, in fact, about weakness of will. Here's an example. All things considered, I think it's better not to eat cake, but when it comes to it, I just can't resist. That's a picture of me eating cake. It's not me. It's a picture of some guy I found on the internet eating a cake. So the problem is, how can I freely act against my better judgment? I'm not addicted to cake, although I might be addicted in some cases to smoking, for instance. That would be a way of acting against my better judgment, but there's not that kind of acting against my better judgment. It's making a judgment that, on the whole, it's better not to eat cake, but then failing to act in accordance with that judgment. I'm not otherwise forced to eat cake. I just decide not to do it and do it anyway. So the question is how this is possible. Now, this problem has exercised modern philosophers since Davidson, who really brought it back into under philosophical scrutiny, but it had been a topic for much debate in the ancient world, and it dropped out, sometime around the Renaissance. It really doesn't feature in Enlightenment thinking very strongly. Nonetheless, Plato is the first person to bring this problem to our attention in dialogues such as the Meno and the Protagoras, and so we might want to consider his solution carefully. Now, I think what his solution tries to capture is the sense of the way we talk about weakness of will. When I ate the cake, you might say, I was overcome with hunger. I might have a feeling, moreover a phenomenological point of view, a feeling of powerlessness, a feeling as though I can't control myself. Now, on a standard interpretation of what Plato's response to this weakness of will problem is that he says that the soul has parts. One part decides the best course of action, and then other parts of the soul might overcome it. Now, for this strategy to work, Plato is going to have to argue that the soul does have parts. And in fact, for other strategies that have approached the weakness of will problem, they sort of assume that the soul has parts. Plato is one of the only thinkers who gives an argument for it. Now, I'm not going to return to the weakness of will problem as such, but that's just the context in which the partition argument, the argument I'm going to discuss today, comes from Plato, and the philosophical context in which it sits. So what then is the partition argument? The argument has 6 premises in Plato's formulation. First premise is what looks like a principle of non-contradiction, although there are some important differences between this and the principle of non-contradiction that we're familiar with. Plato says that the same thing can act or be acted upon in opposite ways at the same time, in the same respect, and in relation to the same object. So Plato gives an example of a man standing still but moving his arms. And it seems to be acting in opposite ways, standing still, moving, being still and moving. Okay, so you're acting in opposite ways. At the same time, you're both standing still and waving your arms in the same respect. So you're not moving and still in the same respect. You're moving with respect to your arms, you're still with respect to your legs. And this is a correct condition in terms of your object. So if you're acting on something, you're not acting in the same way towards this. You don't bear the same relation to the object you're acting on in both cases. Plato then adds a premise about mental states, about desire and aversion. They should be classed along with opposite ways of acting or being affected. It seems that desire is one way of acting towards something, and aversion is another way of acting towards it. That seems to be Plato's thought. Now, this is the important premise, or a premise that people have pressed this argument on. Thirst is the desire for drink. But Plato states it almost that baldly, and then moves on to the fourth premise in the argument. From these three premises, it follows that if an agent, Achilles, is thirsty and at the same time feels an aversion to drinking, there are within Achilles two different entities, one of which leads Achilles to drink, and one of which draws Achilles back from drinking. Why does that follow? Well, it seems that Achilles has a desire and aversion to the same object. Now, because that is one single object, it means that the same thing, that means that there must be at least two things in Achilles. Okay? And because it's the soul that has a desire and aversion to the same thing, there must be two things in the soul. That's Plato's thought. Now, then these premises 5 and 6 simply instantiate premise 4, that is, they say that the antecedent of that conditional is true. It does sometimes happen that Achilles is thirsty and at the same time has an aversion to drinking. You know, that happens all regularly with people. And Socrates and Glaucon in the dialogue are perfectly happy both to accept that. Therefore, there are within Achilles two different entities, one of which leads Achilles to drink and one of which draws Achilles back from drinking. Now, the important thing about this argument is that it relies on psychic conflict. So there has to be a conflict within the psyche, and it's that conflict which motivates the division of the psyche into two parts. So there's got to be a conflict between desiring to drink and being averse to drink. And as long as there's that conflict, and as long as you have to respect this first premise, that nothing can act or be acted upon in opposite ways at the same time in the same respect, in particular in relation to the same object, then the argument stands a chance of going through. But as soon as you drop this condition, as soon as you drop this assumption that there's genuine psychic conflict or somehow come to manoeuvre around it, then the argument can't go through. Okay, so that's Plato's argument. What's the standard objection to it? What are the problems with this argument? I'm going to deal with one problem that's come up very often in the contemporary and commentary literature, and I'm going to show how Plato's particular view of how relations work can help him out to solve this problem. Okay, so as I say, we're focusing on premise 3, and this premise seems to be ambiguous between two possible interpretations. There's one way you could take thirst is the desire for drink, and that's as a psychological truth, and another way you could take it is as a conceptual truth. So looked at as a conceptual truth, it's simply a definition of thirst. Thirst, as such, is a sort of desire. In particular, it's the desire for drink, as such. You could say that drink is the formal object of thirst. What does that mean? Well, because the definition involves a relation, the relation has to have an object, but it's not any particular drink, because it's a definition, it has to cover all cases of thirst. So we just say it's a formal, I'm just going to say that it's a formal object. It's the object as such. Now, we often talk in this sort of way. I thirst for water, I do not thirst for salt water. A child might say, I'm thirsty, and their parent says, well, you can have some water, and the child says, I'm not thirsty for water, I'm thirsty for Coke. These kinds of things. Now, these expressions may capture something, but if this is the right definition of thirst, they seem conceptually confused, because thirst can only be for drink, right? Only statements where you talk about drinking, where you talk about drink as the object of thirst, can be correct statements. What those 1 and 2 on that slide seem to suggest is that really what you desire is water, and you don't desire salt water. The child might desire Coke, even though it's not thirsty, or it might not desire water. Okay, so that's what they seem to mean. But thirst, when we're giving a definition of thirst, well, thirst, insofar as that definition is correct, seems that it relates, properly speaking, only to drink. However, as a definition, this tells us nothing about what some particular person in fact wants or rejects. Okay, so that's important because we seem to be dealing with a psychological phenomenon here. This phenomenon of both desiring and rejecting. So it might be prima facie problematic to take this idea of desire for thirst on a conceptual level. So what happens if we read this as a psychological truth? Well, as a psychological truth, it would be an observation. Thirst can be satisfied for some individual in multiple ways depending on a range of factors. So beer might satisfy your thirst, wine might satisfy your thirst, water might satisfy your thirst, Coke might satisfy your thirst, and so forth and so on. There are different kinds of drink that can satisfy thirst, and that seems to be an empirical psychological fact. Now, although in many cases thirst can be satisfied in multiple ways, maybe not any sort of drink will do in a particular case. Maybe as a psychological fact, Achilles desires water, but rejects salt water. Okay. Now, conceptually speaking, if he has thirst, then it must be for drink of any sort. But as a matter of psychological fact, it seems that he can desire water and reject salt water perfectly consistently. And as I say, if we're interested in arguing about the psychology of individuals, this seems a plausible way to read premise 3. However, read as a psychological truth, this premise 3, thirst is a desire for drink, threatens to undermine the partition argument. Under the psychological reading, all the partition argument shows is that Achilles must desire some kind of drink. Not necessarily any kind of drink will do, because as we saw, in some cases Achilles is going to desire drink water, but not desire salt water. And so, in fact, Achilles need not desire and reject the same kind of drink. Okay, so that Achilles, as I say, might desire, even though both water and salt water are drinks, Achilles can desire water but not salt water. Now, because you can both desire and reject because Achilles might end up desiring and rejecting different objects on a particular occasion, there's not necessarily a psychic conflict here. In some cases there might be a psychic conflict, you might desire and reject the same drink, but not in all cases. So there's not necessarily a partition. So the argument looks on dubious ground, because, if you recall the first premise, the same thing can't be acted upon in relation to the same object. But what we've done is just deny this D part, Achilles is acting upon, he has a desire towards one object and an aversion to a completely different object. So this relational criterion D isn't satisfied. So there is no psychic conflict, so the argument doesn't go through. There might be another problem with reading this premise as a psychological truth as well. Now, say Achilles, in some particular case, happens to desire and reject the same drink, but this looks like it's just a case of acrasia. Okay, so Achilles desires some water, but also rejects that water. Well, one of two. Well, either he is encratic and doesn't take the drink, but maybe he does take the drink. In that case, he had a desire and an aversion to the same object. But that looks just like he's failed to maintain his enkrateia, is the Greek expression. It just seems like he's behaved weakly. His will has been weak. But the partition argument was supposed to explain a weakness of will by partitioning the soul. But if weakness of will is invoked, then as part of the argument, part of the partition argument, that the soul has parts, that argument can't explain weakness of will, because it would then be circular. Okay, so you want to explain weakness of will, you need the partition argument to do that, but then the partition argument relies on there being weakness of will. And that seems explanatory, so that seems circular. Okay. So it looks like we've got this kind of equivocation fallacy, or perhaps a category error fallacy. Thirst is a desire for drink, read psychologically makes the partition argument fail, but read conceptually there's still hope. Read conceptually there is only one possible object for thirst, namely drink as such. Likewise, if the disgust or rejection, disgust is the rejection of drink, then there's only one object, namely drink. So there can be a psychic conflict, there can be a desire and a rejection for drink, and that's a one unified object, so there is a genuine psychic conflict. Now, this might be unacceptable